Thank you all for registering and joining us for our webinar here today around consent mode, all of the requirements related to consent modes. Our goal here today is to give everyone a really good understanding, to walk away understanding exactly what consent mode is, why it's a requirement for most organizations here before March 6th, how it works, how to implement, how to test, and some of the benefits as well as some of the compliance considerations that are related to the technology. So very ambitious, but we hope that this can be valuable for everyone. To kind of test ourselves and test the content, we want to open up with just a quick opening questions. 2 questions here related to your current understanding of consent modes, as well as how ready you believe that your organization is for this March 6th deadline. We're going to use this to kind of test, just to be able to understand, where are people when we come into this presentation and this content, and then we'll ask the same questions on the tail end, and hopefully we can all leave in a much better position than we have started. So we're really all over the spectrum looking at the results. We're going to go ahead and end the poll. We're getting a few more folks, and then we can jump right into the content. Cool. So real quick housekeeping, who we are that is presenting today and who we are as an organization. So who we are, I'm Lucas. I am our head of global privacy strategy at InfoTrust. And then I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Corey. Corey, I'll let you quickly introduce yourself.
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Corey. I'm a senior tag management engineer at InfoTrust. Happy to be here.
So I already kind of went through what it is that we'll be talking about today as it relates to consent modes. Quick disclaimer, we'll talk about some of these compliance implications of consent mode, of the technology. There's some considerations for why it is necessary. But as with any of those legal topics, this is just educational in nature. Always consult your own legal counsel before making any decisions or changes relative to compliance with the law. So to dive directly in here, why are we having this discussion today? Well, it's because there is the requirement that beginning on March 6th, the consent mode signals, and the signals which we'll talk about related to consent mode, must be present for data collected from European Economic Area users via Google tags. So that's inclusive of Google Analytics, floodlights, ads tags, so like ads conversion tags, ads remarketing, that those signals must be present for that data to be used for targeted advertising use cases. So basically see here audience creation, retargeting within Google platforms. Now, March 6th, that deadline relates to the use of that data for advertising use cases, but Google has kind of alluded to that consent mode must be in place to use that data for measurement use cases as well later in 2024. There is no date for that set yet, but in some of the communications that you may have seen from Google that they sent out to anyone that has access to an ads account, they did allude to measurement use cases later in 2024. So a couple of just kind of points here that people ask about. If you're not using data from EEA users, technically, then this consent mode kind of requirement would not be applicable because it is applicable for processing related to those EEA users. If you're not using any data collected in something like Google Analytics or the Google Ads tags for targeted advertising, again, okay, you might not have this requirement in order to be able to continue any of your use cases kind of in the near term. But again, if you're using any of that data, even for those EEA users for measurement use cases, it's a good idea to implement, as there will likely be this requirement to use the data for those use cases later in the year. We're also recommending for all of our clients, even if you do have a global ecosystem, or maybe if you're not using that data from European users, still a good idea to implement consent mode everywhere as the rising tide of regulations and compliance kind kind of requirements is there. This is likely to be a requirement more globally in the future. So that's the requirement. Why is this the case? And this is going to help us to really understand a lot for like how things are working and what it is that we need to look for. So why is the case? Where do these dates come from? This is all related to this initial requirement, the Digital Markets Act. So Google, as a gatekeeper under the European Digital Markets Act, gatekeeper platforms need to have a record of consent, a record that consent has been granted in order to use that end user data for purposes of targeted advertising. So essentially, Google needs a standards with which to use and with which to indicate that a particular user has granted consent, and they need to have that record of consent in order to be able to process the data for this particular purpose. So what consent mode is, it's a standard component of the architecture that allows for this common signal to be present for all of those Google tags. So instead of having to configure something uniquely for GA4, uniquely for your floodlights, uniquely for Google Ads, we can configure consent mode, and then those signals are then updated and present across the entire suite of those Google tags and those different platforms. So that's kind of the why here. It's also the why for this short timeline between a lot of the announcements related to consent modes and that March 6th deadline in order to be able to get it in place. It's also why that deadline can't move. This isn't third-party cookie deprecation. It can't be kicked down the lane based upon adoption. So now that we understand what the requirement is and why that is in place, now let's get into what is consent mode. How does it work? So what consent mode is it's a component of a website or an application, your data collection architecture. And what it will do is translate the consent preferences of a user as they're indicated by your consent management platform into a common standard signal that is readable by all of those different Google tags that are loading on that same page. Now, based upon that consent signal, as indicated by the consent mode component of that architecture, those Google tags will automatically, one, modify their behavior in accordance with those which you think of as instructions that are laid out by consent mode, as well as they will update particular parameters within the data that's being passed. And so that Google has those common signals and common records of consent that they can then base their processing logic upon. So we'll walk through this in kind of a few different ways to really build upon our understanding. So first, if we think about kind of traditionally, how traditional tags and consent management and tags would work in relation to a user's consent. So traditionally, user comes to your website or your application, and they're presented with a consent banner. So consent management platform is there. Users indicate or is presented with accept, reject, user makes a decision. Upon that decision, your consent management platform is going to make a technical indication of what that decision was. So what categories has that user accepted? What have they declined? And then from there, you would configure your tags to behave accordingly. Do they load? Do they not load? Do they collect data? All of that. Kind of very simple, relatively, type of an approach. Now, what consent mode does, that additional component, is it adds an additional layer to this process. And I mentioned before how consent mode will translate those signals that are presented by the consent management platform, and it will change those into a common set of instructions that are readable and usable by the Google tags. So the consent management platform is still a part of this process, still manages the front end, still manages those records of consent. Consent mode is just inserted into that process in order to be able to make those indications in a common format usable by the Google tags. So we move from that traditional kind of approach into a new approach where we insert consent mode into the process. So building upon our understanding here, user comes to the website. User is presented with the consent banner. They accept, they reject, they choose specific categories. The CMP, the consent management platform that is in place, provides those indications in a kind of a technical way as to what categories or what the consumer has consented to or has rejected. Then we insert in consent mode, which translate those signals or indications of consent into that standard readable format. And then our Google tags read from the consent mode indications in order to be able to modify their behavior. Now, conceptually, this is true. We insert consent mode in, and it adds a step into this process. But with consent mode, it's not a direct linear process as represented here. It's a little bit more complicated. So let's build in kind of that those further specifics. So again, user comes to the website, presented by the consent experience by the consent management platform, and they make an indication of their consent choice. At that time, consent management platform provides those signals that are available for us to use as to what the user has consented to. Now, as I mentioned before, this is not a linear process. When those indications of consent are made, consent mode reads from those indications, translates it into that standard format that is readable and usable by the Google tags. But in parallel to this, our Google tags are first also referencing those consent signals as they've been raised by the consent management platform. You can still choose to not load any of these Google tags if a user has rejected consent. That's what's called the basic implementation, which Corey will talk about a little bit much further here in a little bit. So we still manage our Google tags to load or to not load, to execute or to not execute, based upon those records of consent as indicated by the consent management platform. Now, in scenarios where, yes, we do want to load those Google tags, it's at that point that they will then turn and read the instructions from consent mode in that standard format, which is going to tell them how exactly to behave. So the indication from the CMP in that part of the configuration tells those tags that they should run or not. If yes, they should run, and when they do execute, they will reference consent mode in order to be able to update that indication of consent for any of the data that is collected. And they can also modify their behaviors in a few other ways based upon those instructions as set out by consent mode. And then it's after that point that the tags will actually run, send data, set cookies, do all of their normal processing activity. So that's how all this looks in concept. Now, let's root this in a real example and continue to kind of build on some of these concepts to be able to get a more holistic understanding of how this is working. So again, user comes to our website, is presented with a consent banner. They have the option to reject, they have the option to accept, they can go in and look at the settings to be able to see the more granular choices of categories. Now, when they make that selection with the CMP, in the background of the page, your consent management platform, again, is making some technical indications as to what the consent status of that user is. Now, most consent management platforms will make this indication in two different ways. Number one is that they will set a first-party cookie, which carries those categories and the indication of consent for each of the categories that you have defined. They will often also have an object on the page that will also store those indications or records of consent. And we use these in order to be able to control when a tag fires or when it does not fire, or when certain data is being able to be passed within a tag configuration based upon that indication of consent. Now, this is kind of technically what it looks like with a few screenshots there, the first party cookies, the different groups. If we think about it kind of more conceptually, just how most people think of their consent management platform, those records of consent, or those indications or signals of consent, break out to the categories. What categories do you have set up within your CMP? And then how are you kind of configuring those different tags or organizing them based upon those categories? So oftentimes out of the box, we might be using strictly necessary, functional, performance, targeting. And the CMP is indicating via a code, so 1, 2, 3, 4, that is associated with each of those categories. And then it'll use a binary in order to be able to indicate true, false. Now, if we think back to our purpose for why consent mode is being implemented or has to be implemented, and what Google's requirements and Google's obligations are, for a single website, this is fine. But think about, again, from the Google perspective, all kinds of different CMPs have all kinds of different categories. They have all kinds of different ways in which to be able to encode what those categories are. They have all kinds of different ways in order to indicate true, false, or other types of conditionals. And so, again, if we think back to that why, Google needs a standard indication for all of that data that's collected by their tags in order to be able to process that information, lawfully with their new obligations. And so in order to kind of get around that significant burden that would be placed on advertisers, that you would need to update within each of the individual tags in order to be able to make kind of a standard indication of consent, that again is where consent mode comes in. And so here, when we think about the translation, so kind of back to our scenario, consent mode or your CMP is making these indications of consent for those different categories. It's indicating those based upon kind of encoding those categories, as well as then providing that binary indication for each of true, false. Now, consent mode, again, is configured to read from those categories from the CMP and then provide its own technical indication or instructions in a standard format that is readable by the Google tags. Now, how consent mode does this is that it will, again, take that information from the CMP indication, translate it into its own object on the page. When this happens, no data is sent. Consent mode on its own is not collecting or sending any data to Google. It's doing this translation process and providing those instructions for Google tags all on the page. So kind of in the background here, we have, again, our CMP that's indicating those different categories, indicating true, false. We then have consent mode that has its own standard categories. And then with our configurations, when we set this up, what we're doing is mapping for those translations. And so we're mapping our categories from the CMP to our categories within consent modes in order to be able to provide that binary. For consent mode, the purpose is granted or denied based upon what the consent indication is from the individual user as indicated from the CMP. Now, again, all of this happens just on the page in the background. I've mentioned before, I really want to drive the point home. It's only if and when Google tags execute that they will read from those consent mode signals and then adjust their behavior accordingly, according to those different signals that are present. So think about it again in a more kind of structured example here. User comes to a page, indicates via the CMP that they are accepting consent for 3 of our categories. They accept consent for strictly necessary, functional, performance, but they deny or do not consent to targeting or those advertising use cases. Well, first, I've configured my Google tags to read from that which they have accepted or denied. So in this scenario, I'm only loading Google Analytics. And this would be what we call a basic implementation. So Google Analytics is the only tag loading. Google Analytics is reading from those consent modes categories and those consent mode indications. And then Google Analytics is going to modify its behavior according to these instructions. Now, the Google tags specifically will be looking for the status of 4 different parameters as defined within that consent mode configuration. So 4 different parameters are highlighted there. The ad storage, analytics storage, the ad user data, and then the ad personalization. So our Google tags are going to read from those. Those are our instructions as provided by consent mode. And then the tags will modify their behavior accordingly. Now, what are those categories? And how will the Google tags kind of modify their behavior? So for those 4 primary consent signals that are present, the first one is ad storage. Both ad storage and analytics storage relates to how the Google tags will behave in relation to cookies being set or cookies being accessed. So ad storage controls and it enables storage such as cookies or device identifiers related to advertising. So if ad storage is granted, then our Google tags will set and access cookies related to advertising. If it's denied, they won't. Analytic storage, same kind of idea here, but it's related to cookies that are set or cookies that are used for the purpose of measurement and for analytics. An example here would be like the GA client ID or that underscore GA cookie. If this is granted, GA will access those cookies. If it is not, then it will not. Add user data sets consent for sending user data to Google for online advertising purposes. When declines or denied, personal data collection for online advertising is disabled, and that includes user ID and enhanced conversions. If those are sent up, Google will not process that data for the advertising use cases. Ad personalization, similarly, sets consent for personalized advertising. When that is denied, personalized advertising is disabled, and remarketing features within Google's ad products will not receive data. They will not process data for those purposes. So these are 4 kind of primary indications of consent or signals of consent within that consent mode implementation. These are the 4 that the Google tags will reference and use as instructions for how exactly they should behave given the current consent condition. These also control those indications of consent that the Google tags will update and then send up with all of the data that is collected. Google will then use those common indications of consent in that standard format in order to have that record of processing that they must have in order to be able to process that data for targeted advertising. So I hope that this helps with the kind of conceptual, what is consent mode? How is it working? How does it kind of play together? And now we'll turn it over to Corey so he can get into a lot of the further specifics for how exactly to implement the different implementation types, as well as how to test in order to be able to make sure that everything is set up as it should be or as you expect.
Cool. Thanks, Lucas. All right, so Lucas has explained the what and the why about consent mode. So my goal here is to help explain the how. So mainly explaining how to implement. And first, I'm going to talk about the 2 ways that you can implement Google consent mode. So Google has named these basic and advanced. And these can really be boiled down to this. Basic just means that your tags are still blocked when a user declines consent, and no data is sent to Google. An advanced consent mode setup means that your tags are going to fire even when the user opts out. However, the hit that goes to Google and the network request that's sent to Google will be sent with the appropriate signal, and that's going to ensure that the user's personal data is not accessed by Google's services. So it really is that simple when you think about it, but the implementation of it can be complicated. Okay, so in this section, I'll walk you through how to implement Google Consent Mode on your website. In all of these examples, I'll mainly be demonstrating how to do this in Google Tag Manager, but you can do a similar implementation on pretty much any tag management system, such as Telium or Adobe Launch. There's basically 2 commands that you need to run in order for consent mode signals to be recognized by Google. The first one is the default command, and the second is the update command. And first, we're going to talk about the default command. So the default command is super important, and what it's doing is it's setting the base states for all of our storage options. For Google tags to properly function, this default command should be ran as soon as possible on your website. And there's basically a couple of ways that you can implement this. The first way that you can set up consent mode is to run the gtag method directly on your website. You can see in this code block that there's a default command, and it's setting these states for each of these storage values. So this can be hard-coded directly on your website. You can inject it through some sort of JavaScript injector like GTM or Adobe Launcher, whatever. The other version that you can use, and this is what we most commonly use, is the GTM template tag created by Simo Ahava, which allows a bit more flexibility. It allows you to use GTM variables. It's very easy to use and easy to understand. There's explanations on each of the sections and everything. So typically we'll try to use this when possible. No matter how you're setting these default states, you're doing the same thing whether you're using gtag or you're using the template tag. The big thing here is to make sure that you work with your legal counsel to determine what the default state should be. Should it be denied? Should it be updated? Should it be a variable that changes based on their geolocation or the region that they're visiting from? This is all things that you should make, decisions that you should make with your legal counsel involved. The next command that we'll talk about is the update command. So similarly, you can send this update command via gtag, or you can send it through a template tag in GTM. Very similar to what we just saw. You'll notice that they're pretty much identical. The only thing that's really changing is the command that we use. Instead of default, we're using update. So you'll need to send this update command to the consent mode API after a user makes a consent decision on your website. So what Lucas was talking about before, where they interact with the banner and they make a consent decision, at that point, hopefully your CMP, even if it's homebrewed or whatever, you're setting some sort of event that you can trigger this update to happen. The good news is there are many consent management platforms that do this automatically. So Google has a list in their support documents of what they call certified consent management platforms, and those integrate very well with consent mode. The one you're looking at here is InfoTrust. However, though, if you do have a non-certified CMP, you can still handle the update most of the time, as long as, like I said, there's some sort of event you can hook into, whether it's an event in the data layer or some other object on the page, whenever the user makes a consent decision. If you have a homebrewed solution, as long as you're sending the updated values when your user makes those consent choices and you're running that gtag method, you'll be covered. It's super important to send this update command because when a user makes a choice, for example, if they're in an opt-in market and they are not automatically opted in, the default state is to be denied, right? If a Google tag fires and you never send that update command, when that reaches the Google servers, it's going to be processed accordingly. So it's super important that when the user makes a consent choice, that you are updating these values with either granted or denied. If you have an advanced setup where you're firing your Google tags even without user consent, the update command is going to, it looks like it's sending another network request, a collect v2 hit to Google. However, it's going to stitch together those events and it's going to update the consent signal to whatever existed when that update command was sent. That way, the data in your reports is always going to be accurate to what your user's consent choice was. So I talked about this, you just saw it in the prior slide, but many consent management platforms out there can integrate super well with Google Consent Mode. Some CMPs will handle both the default and the update commands and the values associated, but a lot of them only update or handle the update command. Regardless, reach out to your internal or external experts for your consent management platform to see if this functionality exists for you. One example is InfoTrust, who is a Google certified CMP, super popular CMP. A lot of people use them. You'll see in this screenshot, they automatically will send the update command, and you can specifically map which categories translate to the various storage types that consent mode has. In InfoTrust specifically, this is not on by default. So for this and other CMPs, make sure that you go in and check the settings to see if this functionality exists and if it needs to be enabled for you. So implementing consent mode is one thing, but how do you know that it's working? This is probably the trickiest part, is the validation piece, right? So there's a couple of ways that you can confirm that the consent mode signals are being sent with your Google Hits. The first one that you can use is Google Tag Assistant. So there's a new feature in here relatively recently. When you're previewing a GTM container and you're using Tag Assistant, you can click on this new tab labeled Consent up in the top right, and it's going to show you the default state, the updated state, and whatever the current state is for that event in the event stream. You can view this for each event in the list, and it gives you an idea of what the consent states are on page load and as users navigate your page and complete conversion events and stuff. This is super useful too if you're using the GTM consent overview feature, which does allow you to block or allow tags based on these storage values. This is very useful for testing that. Most people who have a CMP are not using this feature, but I thought I'd put this in here just to let you guys know. But this is one way that you can test. The second method, which is a bit more technical, is to look at the network request that's sent to Google. As you can see here, it's not exactly the easiest thing to interpret, but luckily Chrome's Dev Console automatically will parse these parameters out in the payload tab. So in the payload tab, the first parameter that we can look at here is the GCS parameter. Now this one's been around for a while since consent mode became a thing. And on the right here, you'll see a breakdown of each number and what it means. The first G followed by a 1 is just the versioning for Google Consent Mode. The second number represents ad storage, and this is a binary value, so either a 0 or a 1 that represents denied or granted. And then the third number represents analytics storage, which is the same thing. It's a binary value for denied or granted. So in the screenshots you're seeing here, my network request that I have, it's a G111, which indicates that I have fully consented to both ad and analytics storage. But you will notice that this only includes 2 storage values, which are ads and analytics. But Lucas was talking about a couple of extra parameters that have come out with conversion or with consent mode v2. So I want to talk about those as well. This is where the GCD parameter comes into play. So with consent mode v2, as mentioned, there's 2 new parameters that are passed in with the signals. The first one is add user data and add personalization. Translating this is super tricky. It's a lot more complicated than it was with the version 1 GCS code, which was just, very simple on or off, but we'll try to break it down the best we can. So down below, what you'll see is basically a translation of that GCD value. The query string for this is always going to start with the 1. That indicates that it's the beginning of the string. And then they use the number 3 as a separator for each category. So after the 1 and the first 3, so that's a separator, we have ad storage, analytics, ad user data, and ad personalization. And it's going to go through each of these categories, and it will have a letter that represents a different scenario. After all that's done, it will end with some number. I've seen 5, I've seen 7. It's kind of all over the place with the final number, but basically if it's not a 1 or a 3, that means that the string has ended. All these letters mean different things. So some mean that there was nothing detected at all. Some mean that it was by default denied and updated to granted after consent was given. And here's just a few examples of what these codes can mean. So as you can see, it's kind of confusing. There's not really it is consistent, but there's a lot of letters that represent different things out there. Huge shout out to just the tagging community and the forums and Measure Slack and everything for trying to develop sort of a key for this schema. It's been a lot of help, at least for us internally. So much appreciation to the community. And then the last parameter that we'll look at is NPA, which stands for non-personalized advertising. Basically, if this is set to 1, it completely disables all Google Ad personalization features for the hit. So in the example that we see here, because I had fully opted in, it is set to a 0, meaning that it would not block it. So now that we've shown you all the complexities of testing Google Consent Mode, wouldn't it be nice to just click a button and have something tell you what all the different combinations are? Well, we decided to make something to help with this. So I'm introducing InfoTrust's Google Consent Mode Inspector. So what this is, it's a super lightweight extension for Chrome, and it allows you to quickly see the default state and the updated states for Google Consent Mode on your website. You can see in the top right, there's a little green or red indicator on the extension shortcut. It's going to show you if consent mode is active or inactive on the site, along with the consent mode active or inactive at the top bar. And it will show you all of these storage values that exist today. It can also show you if there is no signal received at all. So basically, if something is wrong or you haven't implemented consent mode on your site, this is a quick way to check that. We also wanted to include the GCD values and try to have an easy to understand translation of what all of these letters mean. So as you look at the most recent payload here, it should break down exactly what these mean. And if there's any changes, we'll make sure to update these to try and help explain. And then the last tab here on history, you can see the individual network requests and what the consent states were at the time. So you can parse through all of your Google hits and look at each one. The event name is included, so you know which one you're looking at, the tracking ID it's going to, etc. But yeah, this is something that we hope can help out. So a small disclaimer, though, this is a tool for a Google product that is still being actively developed, which is consent mode. So your results may vary a little bit. We are closely monitoring all the changes that Google makes, announced or unannounced. So we'll update the extension accordingly. We use this internally all the time, so we have a vested interest in keeping this up to date. Just as an example, we talked before about the threes that were the separators. Literally like 3 weeks ago, those were ones. So we had to very quickly update the extension and make sure that it was working as expected. So we'll stay on top of this. Our goal here is just to help out the measurement community in general. And we know that there's a lot of frequent changes with Google Consent Mode, and this is just our gift to you all. And the best thing, as mentioned, this is available right now in the Chrome store. So if you want to go check it out, please do. We'll also provide a link in the slide deck and in the follow-up email after the webinar. Just an FYI, we were having an issue this morning with the web store. I'm not sure what was going on, but it was not letting some of us download it. So hopefully Google gets it fixed pretty soon, but definitely bookmark it for later if you want to use it. And the last thing I want to talk about here is sort of scalable solutions with consent mode and testing. So if you have a need for this type of scaled testing, either like your entire site list or just a large number of sites, you can leverage Tag Inspector, which is one of our proprietary products. When scans are run, Tag Inspector is able to identify if your Google tags are loading and what parameters are being passed. So you can see in the screenshot here, there's our GCS, our GCD, and our NPA parameters. Well, not NPA, but yeah, those are all there available. And it's very useful for testing your basic implementation, which, if you recall, means that the tags don't fire for users that don't consent. So it's a really good way to test for that and make sure that what you've done in practice is what's happening on the live site. So this tool will translate it into a usable format that you can use to validate all of this. Cool. All right. That's all I have from a technical perspective. So I will send it right back to you, Lucas.
Thank you, Corey. Wonderful, super helpful for how exactly to implement as well as how to test to make sure that implementation is done properly. Kind of to round this out, we talked about what consent mode is, how it works, how to implement. Now, once you implement, what is it that kind of additional value that you're able to realize as a result of having consent mode implemented? Well, number one, kind of the stick side of the carrot and stick equation. You can still use data collected from EEA users for those advertising use cases after March 6th. So that's baseline requirement, has to be implemented in order to be able to use data for that purpose. Second, also, more on the stick side, we can still use data collected from EEA users for measurement use cases later in 2024. So this again relates to just those like base level requirements. We want to be able to use our data. So this has to be implemented in order to do so. There's also some kind of additional additive value pieces that can be realized from consent mode. The first one is conversion modeling. So once consent mode is in place, you'll start to see conversion modeling likely show up into your reports, both in GA4 as well as across Google Ads platforms. And conversion modeling is made available regardless of if you have that basic or if you have the advanced implementation of consent modes in place. In conversion modeling, what it does is Google will use data that does not identify individual users in order to be able to estimate conversions that they're unable to observe directly. That would be due to user not consenting or limited access to cookie identifiers, things like that. So it can model both for attribution as well as for some of those conversion counts. And it's meant to help provide a more accurate conversion attribution in light of that kind of loss of visibility into deterministic data resulting from consent. Now, if you have implemented the advanced version of consent modes, you can also take advantage of behavioral modeling, which is available within GA4. Now, behavioral modeling, as I mentioned, it requires that advanced implementation. And if you have that advanced implementation in place and you have sufficient traffic to meet a number of different thresholds, volume thresholds that Google has applied for this modeling, then you'll begin to see the behavioral modeling data within the blended reporting identity of the UI. And what behavioral modeling does is it estimates behavioral data based upon user and session metrics, such as daily active users, as well as conversion rates that might be unobservable without cookies or without those IDs. So additional modeling to be able to kind of fill in that visibility gap that results from, again, consumers not consenting. So implement consent mode, one, because it's a requirement to continue using your data, but also there are these kind of value adds that can be realized as a result as well. So we've talked a lot about consent mode, what it is, how it works, how to implement. Wanted to just include this helpful resource page here. Again, we will send out the deck for everyone that has joined and everyone that has registered. So you'll have access to all these links. They'll also be included in that email. But number one, we have created a consent mode resource page that includes a ton of FAQs, both for general business as well as a number of FAQs that we're typically getting from compliance folks at organizations that are concerned about or questioning how exactly consent mode works and what are some of those implications for the data collected, making sure that disclosures are there, consent policies are being followed, all of that. Those FAQs are also on that page. There is also an opportunity there to submit, and we will do a review, a small review of the website that you submit in order to be able to test what your consent mode implementation looks like on that website. So we can give you some quick insights as to, is it implemented properly, and any potential risks that might be there relative to not being able to use your data, as well as potential compliance risks for a wrong implementation where you maybe are collecting certain things that you probably shouldn't be given the user's consent state. Also linked in there is the Chrome extension that Corey mentioned. That's amazing for individual page testing. Highly recommend anyone implementing to implement that, start using that. And then I've also listed out all of the Google resources. A lot of the direct from Google support pages, developer documentation relative to the functionality, how it works, as well as how to implement. Before we get into questions, which I know we have a number of, we've reserved about 15 minutes to try to get through those. I would be remiss if I did not mention also some of our other content, specifically for folks in Europe coming up. We are having a Cookieless Now Summit in London that we are putting on at the Google office, one of the Google offices there in London on the 10th of April. Check out that link in order to be able to kind of register for that. We'll be going through a number of kind of cookieless solutions, different topics, in order for organizations to be well positioned for success as we move into a world without third-party cookies and with these kind of increasing compliance requirements. Now, we will open it up for questions. I know a number of people have submitted them throughout, so we'll start going through those. While we do so, I'm also going to open up our closing poll. I mentioned in the opening poll, if folks could throw in there how kind of comfortable you are with your understanding of consent mode and your readiness for implementation. Would love to know how you feel now, now that we've gone through a lot of this content. And hopefully it's been helpful in order to be able to raise that level of understanding. If you still do have any kind of specific questions or concerns about the implementation, or if you need help, please reach out to us. We are ready and willing. I'm very happy to help out however we possibly can. So let me kind of pull up the Q&A. We can kind of start from the top, I believe. Okay, first question. Does sending conversion signals count if it's not audience development and management in order to enable bidding in Google Ads or SA360 specifically? I think this is relative to the March 6th deadline. That March 6th deadline is related with Google's ability to process EEA user data. So it's specific for that audience creation functionality. Sending up those conversion signals for bid optimization, that's campaign related as well as just conversion related. So it's my understanding that should not be impacted following that date. But again, it is expected that in order for that data, at least that which is collected, even conversion data and measurement data or campaign information from those EEA users, would need those indications of consent later in 2024 in order for that data to be processed at all. So still would recommend to implement consent mode, but yes, you might not be running up against that March 6th deadline if you're not using any of that data for the audience creation or retargeting functionality. There was a question about testing. This is from earlier. I think Corey probably covered all of those topics. Unfortunately, there is nothing like step-by-step guide explicitly from Google at this point. That's why it's kind of all community related, as Corey mentioned before, and kind of everyone's doing the best that they can with what we have. But it is clear, what the requirements are, what is a good implementation, what is not. We can use a lot of those tools in order to be able to verify that. I also got word about 30 minutes prior to our webinar that at least in GA, it looks like Google is rolling out updates that provide an indication within the account if those consent mode signals are being collected for a given website or for a given GA property. Like I mentioned, we just started seeing this 20 minutes ago, or I guess now an hour ago. So I'm not sure kind of like to what extent that works or how well that works, but that's another indication that hopefully folks will have, at least within GA, hopefully also within the ads accounts, in order to be able to help verify an implementation. A question of if it's possible to implement consent mode without a CMP. Corey, any kind of thoughts on implementation without a consent management platform in place?
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit, and this was right before I had spoke, but it is possible. I mean, as long as you're setting the default and then sending the update when a user makes their consent choice, you're covered. You can mimic exactly what a CMP is doing, as long as you're making that happen when the user makes a choice.
Another question, I think kind of related to the mapping. What happens to null tags? So no tag itself necessarily would ever be null. I think you're referring to if any of those consent mode categories or those consent mode kind of specific storage options would be set to null or are not defined. In those cases, as you saw when Corey was walking through those different parameters and those examples, basically those null values would just not be defined. Now, what consent mode does is it will look for the status of one of those categories on the update commands. And if that is not defined or is null, it will then look at for the default command status. So think about it as like the default command sets your initial versioning, and then the update command does exactly what it sounds like. It updates it. And so if something is null in that update command, but it was defined in the default commands, it would kind of still have whatever that value is for the default. Your issues are going to run into if you don't have it defined, a particular category defined for either, at least in those four, the ad storage, analytic storage, ad personalization, and ad user data, those are the ones that are critical for that usage of the EEA user data and control actual Google tag functionality. So if something is not defined for either, you don't have a record of consent for the ad personalization or for the ad user data. And then if it is not set for either of those storage options, you're going to run into some functionality issues and some weirdness in your data in those cases. Let's see. Question of, if using advanced consent mode, does the data that we collect before consent is granted get anonymized? In a word, no. How Google is kind of approaching that is that because if you're using advanced, it really depends on exactly how you have it implemented. But if you're using advanced and all those options are set to denied, the no identifiers are being referenced or collected with a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of caveats to that, which then at least device identifiers wouldn't be collected. So that's how it's considered cookieless and kind of anonymous. I don't know if Google actually uses the anonymous terminology, but in that case, in a traditional client-side implementation, at least, you are still sending up that IP address. So it's not anonymized in a like true sense. There are, again, some implementation kind of quirks that can be done in order to be able to scrub a lot of that data before it's sent to GA. But that's kind of like your advanced implementation. But if you do want to talk about that one, reach out to us so we can really talk through some of those options that you might have. Another question on implementation. Corey, I think this one would be a good one for you. How do you decide the tags in relationship to the consent mode category? So for example, Google Floodlight tags, is that only controlled by ad storage? Are there other categories that be mapped there? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll always talk with your legal counsel first to decide. I mean, it's the same way as when you're blocking or allowing tags in your tag manager. You have to think about what that tag's doing, right? Something like a floodlight tag, is it building audiences? Is it retargeting people? Then it should probably go in a targeting category. If it's strictly something analytics related, or maybe it's functional to your page, there are usually categories in consent management platforms for that. So if we're talking about OneTrust specifically, something like a floodlight tag would more than likely fit into a targeting category, and that's what you would map. You'd map like ad storage and targeting together in OneTrust. But again, talk with your legal counsel and figure out what you think the best decision would be.
Another implementation question, which I think is a good one. Well, they're all good questions, but this one I think especially is something that's come up quite a bit in conversations over the last couple of weeks. Is there any reason to use the update command over the default commands, other than if you're already using a CMP?
So, I mean, both are potentially needed. The default command, it depends on how you have it set up, right? But if you're just hard coding like denied values, so if you're in Europe, for example, they should be denied on their first visit. So if you're just hard coding those values as denied, I mentioned this before, but if any sort of Google tags fire at that point and you never send that update command, then they're going to be processed like the user has not consented. So I don't necessarily, I don't want to say you'd use one over the other. I think they're both equally important. Uh, and the CMP just automatically handles the update command. That's really all the CMP is doing. Otherwise, you have to do it yourself. But yeah, both are definitely important to having a fully functional setup.
Yeah. I want to underscore that point because it's also come up in some kind of discussions with Google. the strongly recommended implementation is to use both the default and the update. One thing that a number of organizations are running into is that they're not implementing that default command because their CMP is only handling the update. And they're thinking that, okay, I can just go into my consent management platform and it's going to take care of this for me. In 80%, 90% of the cases, it's not. It's only going to do that update portion, and you're going to be missing that default, which can cause some compliance risk, as Corey mentioned, for potentially users that are coming in to the websites and stuff might be happening before consent has been granted, as well as can cause some issues with the utility of the data, just timing and things like that related to only having the update. So it's strongly recommended to use both the default and that update commands for all pages. A question here to confirm: consent mode is mandatory on March 6th just for those EEA sites. Is there a date for when it will be required for all sites? There is no current date for it being required for all sites globally. The March 6th deadline is to be able to have that implemented in order to be able to have those records of consent for those EEA users in order to use that data for those advertising use cases. So audience creation, retargeting. Later in the year, it has been alluded to and stated by Google that those signals will need to be in place to use the data from EEA users for measurement use cases as well. But there is no date nor any kind of clear indication that it will be required to use to be in place to use data from all global users. It's just kind of our stance that as regulations are continuing to evolve globally, it's a good idea to be including those additional records of consent, especially as Google is signaling that they're going to be using them for that standard format for a lot of their functionality. So the hard requirements are just for the EEA users and therefore likely European websites that are targeted for those users or have those users as their audience, for now, at least. Wonderful. Those are the questions that I see. If we've missed any, we will review kind of that full Q&A list following this. We can reach out to you. Definitely reach out to us if you have kind of further questions, and would love to be able to chat further about your specific implementations and your specific testing needs, things like that, as needed. But thank you all for joining us. I can say from the closing poll, it looks like people are walking away from here with a much better understanding than they walked in. So that's wonderful. I credit Corey for that. But thank you all for joining us here today. Hope to see some of you in London for the Cookieless Now Summit, and then all of you on future educational events that we put on. So thank you all very much.